We're almost 1 second. Wow. Eccoci. E siamo in onda adesso. Insomma, intanto benvenuti ai primi spettatori, ascoltatori che si collegheranno. E iniziamo, insomma, come nello scorso incontro ci vuole un attimo di tempo prima di far collegare tutti. Noi siamo puntualissimi, se non quasi in anticipo, secondo il mio orologio, però io sono sempre in ritardo, quindi magari è un'impressione. E ecco, insomma, qualcuno inizia a collegarsi e quindi iniziamo la presentazione di questo incontro. Vedete sullo schermo, oltre a me, Giacomo Zadonini, Davide Lemmi e Ismail Einashe, che è il nostro ospite di oggi. E iniziamo in italiano, però ci sposteremo sull'inglese per parlare con Ismail. Nonostante i nostri mezzi avanzati come Fada, ancora non abbiamo i mezzi per organizzare una traduzione istantanea. Però speriamo di poterlo fare più avanti e anche di incontrarci di persona. Eccoci, quindi questo è il secondo incontro del collettivo Fada, un collettivo formato da 6 giornalisti. Abbiamo lanciato le nostre attività la scorsa settimana, il 9 dicembre, e abbiamo un sito che si chiama fadacollective.com. Chi siamo? Quindi un collettivo di giornalisti italiani che si occupa di esteri, di reportage, soprattutto facendolo sul campo in diversi paesi del mondo, in particolare nel cosiddetto Medio Oriente. Quindi ci sono colleghe e colleghi che si occupano soprattutto di lavori e storie tra Iraq, Siria, Libano e Giordania, e l'altra area in cui abbiamo lavorato e continuiamo a lavorare in modo più significativo è l'Africa, soprattutto diciamo tra il Nord Africa e l'Africa, il Sahel e l'Africa occidentale, in particolare nell'ultimo anno. Fada nasce dall'idea di mettere insieme giornalisti italiani che si occupano di esteri sul campo, freelance, precari, per poter in qualche modo avere un maggior peso anche in Italia, far parlare di esteri in un modo che per noi è importante, che sentiamo spesso, insomma, abbastanza mancante nel panorama mediatico italiano. Quindi con storie approfondite, nate da una presenza lunga, continuativa sul campo, e dando voce soprattutto a persone, comunità locali, raccontando l'ambiente, i diritti, i conflitti, in un modo, in qualche modo, insomma, il più possibile approfondito, dettagliato, raccontando anche le sfumature, i contesti in cui eventi anche storici avvengono, quindi per aiutare a comprenderli, ma anche a vedere il lato umano. Quindi questo è il secondo incontro di lancio di Fada, questa nostra pillola di incontri prenatalizi, che vuole essere un po' un regalo, un contributo a un momento di riflessione. Sono incontri abbastanza brevi che ospitiamo sulla pagina Facebook, poi si possono rivedere su YouTube anche, e qui sempre su Facebook. Vogliono essere un momento di riflessione sulla professione e su alcune sfide del fare gli esteri come freelance oggi, e sullo sguardo che noi adottiamo, soprattutto anche in qualche modo sul privilegio da europei poter muoversi e raccontare anche contesti diversi e viverci anche, e anche come, insomma, una riflessione su come farlo bene e continuarlo a fare. E quindi io mando in onda il nostro video di presentazione, che mette insieme un collage dei nostri lavori, che poi potete vedere anche sul sito, sulle nostre pagine social, e poi entriamo nel vivo di questo secondo incontro.
E siamo tornati online e prima di iniziare di entrare nel vivo delle domande, diamo un pochino di riferimenti anche di Ismail. Giornalista, scrittore, si occupa di migrazioni, diritti umani e reportage, ha scritto tra i vari per il The Guardian, la BBC, il Sunday Times, Foreign Policy, The Nation, è stato borsista della Alice Patterson Foundation, lavorando sul ruolo cinese in Africa, in particolare in Kenya, Etiopia, Tanzania e Zambia. È stato selezionato per l'European Press Prize 2020 e nel 2019 ha ottenuto il Migration Media Award. Inoltre ha curato il libro Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives and the Public Sphere, raccolta di saggi sulla rappresentazione di migranti nei media europei, ed è attualmente giornalista senior presso Lost in Europe, un progetto di giornalismo internazionale che indaga sulla scomparsa di bambini migranti in Europa. E siccome bisogna switchare all'inglese, facciamo la presentazione anche in inglese. Intanto, it's a great pleasure, Ismail, to be with you this evening, and thank you for accepting our invitation. Ismail is a freelance journalist based in London, but currently now in Kenya, Nairobi, as he has written for The Guardian, BBC, Sunday Times, Foreign Policy, amongst others. And currently, he's a senior journalist at Lost in Europe, a project investigating the disappearance of child migrants in Europe. Last year, he was on Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellow, where he reported on China's role in Africa, focusing on Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Zambia. Ismail co-edited the book Lost in Media, Migrant Perspectives and the Public Sphere, a collection of essays on the representations of migrants and refugees in the European media. E adesso entriamo nel vivo di quella che è la discussione, l'intervista. So I'm going to pass the ball to Giacomo Zandonini for the first question.
Grazie mille, Davide. Thank you very much. Allora, faccio una piccola parentesi anche in italiano. Naturalmente qualsiasi domanda in qualsiasi momento è ben accetta. Lo spirito di Fada è proprio questo, anzi mi devo ricordare che verso la fine teniamo un momento rivelazione in cui anche spieghiamo un attimo cosa significa Fada, da dove viene il nostro nome. E comunque, appunto, uno spazio di dibattito, le domande fatele pure anche in italiano, poi noi le traduciamo a Ismail. So, Ismail, thank you for being with us again, and we know you are almost understanding everything we said, and you're becoming an Italian. I mean, you're already Italian and especially Sicilian, but then you're also studying. So we were joking that the next meeting with you in a few years will be directly in Italian.
Yeah. Grazie mille, Davide, Giacomo, and everybody at Fada. Congratulations on this amazing, important project. I so support it. And yes, I am a student of Italian, but I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of you all who are Italian speakers. So let's have another date in 2 years, and then by that point, I will speak such a beautiful Italian that you will all be thinking, "Oh my God!" So we'll save that for the future. But for today, we'll speak in English for today.
For sure. We'll do it. So let's follow the stream. We wanted, as we told you, we had our last meeting was with Bernardo Valli, who is well-known Italian reporter who followed decolonization since the 50s and foreign news for about 60 years probably of his life, so kind of an historical memory of journalism and important historical events in our contemporary world. So we want somehow to take it from there and to come to your work, especially to start with. We wanted to ask you to to make a connection between two subjects you are specifically working with, which are, let's say, migration on one side. You've been covering migration in the past years, and stories of people on the move, also with very important reporting from Italy and Sicily. And there's just your last article came out in the last month, and we'll invite everybody to read them on BBC News. And but also you've been covering for a long time, let's say, society, culture, economy, especially in Eastern Africa. And for us, for Fada, it's quite important to make this connection, because we realized in Italy, most of the reporting on migration, unluckily, is just stopping at the shore. So there is no, it seems like the story of a person who is migrating starts when he arrives in Italy, and there's nothing behind this. While through your work also, I think you created this connection between different stories, which are part of also of a common frame, which is very needed in Europe. So if you can help us also understand this link, here you go.
Thank you, Giacomo and Davide. It's a great honor to come after Bernardo Valli. I know who's a revered figure in Italian journalism. It's a great honor. So I've been covering migration, like Giacomo, who I met on the beat, and many other journalists, such as Davide and others, as part of this collective, but also, I'm sure, listening. So what I might say might not sound particularly new, but one of the things that, question that Giacomo has put to me is really, for me, covering these stories of migration at Europe's border from a different lens. So not just the stories of people who are landing from Libya, who've survived perilous journeys from largely West Africa, from Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria, and who land in Sicily, where I've been for many years reporting from, or in other parts of southern Italy, or indeed other parts of Europe, but actually also looking at the historical continuities that exist, and why people are coming from over there, and for what reason they're coming here. So in Italy, it's particularly an important question, because often there I find is a lack of knowledge generally in Italian society about Italy's colonial history in this region where I am, in East Africa, in Somalia, which is my country of birth, in which the Italians ruled, both before and after Mussolini, to Eritrea, to Ethiopia, which was under Mussolini's fascist occupation, to Libya, to indeed Albania. And these historical connections that Italy has, just sticking this example from East Africa, is not really brought up when it comes to, as Giacomo mentioned, the reporting on this issue of migration in the general media, I find, in Italy. And when people then read the story in Palermo, in Roma, in Milano, wherever they are in Italy, and they say, well, why are people arriving on Italy's shores? They don't understand the long historical relationships that Italy's had with these countries, not just in the historical sense, but also in the contemporary sense. We know that Italy is quite active in the Mediterranean region, has quite important business relationships with Libya. The Italian company has done work in the North Africa, Maghreb region. So these kinds of political, economic, social connections really do matter and manifest and shape the kind of migration we get today. And I think drawing these historical connections is important for us to take stock of the contemporary realities of what drives people to seek safety and fortune and risk so much across such vast parts of Africa to arrive in Libya and in a country which is in such a dangerous situation, and then to make the decision to arrive in Italy. I also think the historical example is important for us to also not just contextualize for that reason, but also to understand the scale of what is actually happening. So, for example, 2015 is the so-called migrant crisis. I put it in inverted commas because Europe is a continent of 500 million people. The UK is about to leave my other country, the EU, on January the 1st, but it's 500 million people and an economy of 19 trillion US dollars. And, you know, there was people coming from Syria because of the Syrian civil war. There were hundreds of thousands that were arriving via the Balkans, via the Eastern Mediterranean to places like Germany. And of course, the situation in Italy and the southern coast of Italy has been ongoing for decades. But 2015 was this moment when we thought there's this idea of this migrant crisis. But put that in context, in the region I'm in, the world's vast majority of the world's refugees, 90%, stay in the regions of conflict. So the refugees from the Somali conflict are actually in Kenya, the ones who are outside Somalia and are internally displaced. Or the refugees from South Sudan are in Uganda or Ethiopia. The refugees from the Syrian civil war are largely in Lebanon and Turkey. So for us, it's really important to think in terms of the scale, because that really drives the narrative. And we've seen the narrative that has happened not just in Italy, but across Europe, which is this right-wing, reactionary, populist, far-right movement, often, you know, based on misinformation and lies about migrants, where they come from and why they're coming. So I think journalism's role in this is really to try, through the work we do, to try and explain the world in a clearer way so that people can make their own decisions and their own judgments. And in terms of this connection, I'll briefly come to, Giacomo, between Africa and Europe. I think it's very important. And you know, this is a connection both historically, because of Europe's relationship with Africa, because of the histories of violence and racism and slavery and colonialism, but also the contemporary histories are really important. And those are the reasons why, you know, we have these issues when it comes to migration. We don't talk about, for example, social justice in all of this. You know, there's a reason why people leave the Sahel. There's a reason why people are leaving Darfur because of climate ecological disasters that are often to do with Western countries and Western companies. Also, we've got to look at the situation with Western foreign policy and the role that's had in terms of people seeking safety and fortune in Europe. So we cannot separate these histories. You know, Europe and Africa have been intertwined for a long time, and these histories have often been histories of violence. And often when I think about this idea of the Mediterranean, I often think of Alessandra Di Maio and her work on the idea of the Black Mediterranean, and really thinking about the idea of the sea, and not just in terms of the reportage that I do when I talk to people who've come off the boats and people who are struggling in the reception centers in Sicily, for example, but also stepping back and really think about what this means at a human level, at a cultural level. And I think some of the stories that Giacomo mentioned that I have done recently, the BBC, really deal with that idea of culture and the idea of memory and the idea of home and what that means and why people leave their countries, whether they're in Nigeria or Eritrea, and come to Italy or come to other parts in Europe, and what their journeys are like and what happens to them on the journey, and what they meet once they get to places like Sicily, which I love the island of Sicily, like I'm sure many of us do. It's a fascinating place, but it's a place of migration historically, and there's just the latest wave of people coming today. And these people are changing Sicilian society today. In Palermo, you see it very clearly. So for me, it's about capturing that too. I hope I've answered that, and I'll stop here.
So thank you, Ismail.
My pleasure.
Actually, I want to do a little jump to another issue. Be journalist. I mean, the reason why you start, but also what does it mean be a journalist now in this particular period? You're contributing to major media outlets, as I said before, no? But still working as a freelancer. So I'd like to know what are the challenges so far, and if it's possible, also how the pandemic affected your work.
Well, I think you know, all of us who work as freelancers, and I guess Fada Collective is made up largely of freelancers, know the challenges of working in this industry. We've seen a massive decline in the news media in terms of you know, newspapers shutting down, in terms of businesses being shuttered, as you mentioned, because of the COVID pandemic. Lots of people have lost their jobs more recently. I think the situation in Italy is quite interesting because obviously I know journalists, friends who are in Italy, like Giacomo and others. And I think, they tend to work actually for foreign news. And I know in Italy, the situation is pretty dire because people in Italy get paid quite badly, I understand, right? When you're working for the mainstream. I think the situation in Britain is a bit different. Generally, if you are working for the legacy or the mainstream media, like Sunday Times, Guardian, BBC, then you are getting paid a decent, rate. But that might not be that often. They might not pay on time, etc. So there's other issues. But if you can do it right, then you can still get good rates as a journalist. I think obviously there are also other issues around being a freelancer, not just both pay, safety, the sense of community, because often we're working alone. That's why Fada Collective is so important in what you're trying to do, which is trying to bring foreign correspondents in Italy together. I think that's really excellent because often foreign correspondents, Davide, you're in Dakar, I'm in Nairobi, Giacomo is in Rome, others listening, watching are in other places in the world. And, we all have to do the same things that, we do as journalists, photographers, filmmakers. We get stories out there, we try and get funding. One thing I have found in the last few years for me personally is that I found really focusing on a beat. So, for example, the migration story that I cover, or specifically focusing on one aspect of that, so looking at child migrants, and then trying to build a team around that, as we did in Lost in Europe, which is a cross-border journalism project in Europe, which investigates the disappearances of child migrants. And there are currently 19 journalists in the investigative project. And, we have a number of newspapers across, I think, 6 countries in the EU working with us, including our colleague Cecilia Ferrara, who's in Italy. And the thing is, through that, we were able to raise money and get a grant. And I think for those of us that can do that, I know it's a small minority maybe, but that is what has allowed me to continue. Just being honest about that. I mean, if I didn't get these grants, through Lost in Europe, Pulitzer grants, I don't think I could do this job really. The Alicia Patterson Foundation, which I encourage everyone to apply for. You don't have to be American to apply for it. I thought you had to be. I'm not. It's America's oldest journalism grant. And last year I got that, and I got $40,000 for the year, which is a lot of money, to produce, I think, 6 stories. So I was very lucky. And it's an excellent thing to have got. So I think the successes I've had as a freelancer have come now. I wish they had come 5 years ago when I was really struggling and trying to put bread on the table, and it was a real challenge. But I think there are opportunities. And one thing I'd add to that, Davide, is I think I find it frustrating when I speak to colleagues who have got staff jobs and they say, oh God, you're still a freelancer. Oh God, it must be so sad. I think if you think in that frame, then you would think that too. You have to think of it as a vocation and a career. You're not going to be rich. You ain't going to make 60,000 euros a year, but you can make enough, and you can teach, you can do research, you can do a bit of consultancy, you can mix the bag of sort of portfolio career. But if you think about it in that frame, oh my God, it's so terrible, I'm a freelancer, then it probably will be. I think this is how I think about it. For me, I think of being a freelancer as an opportunity to be entrepreneurial, to be pan-European, to work across the globe. And also, if you focus on a few key angles, that's the thing. If you focus on a couple of things, you can't do everything. If you focus on a couple of things that you're good at, that you know about, then eventually it will just happen. You will just become an expert. I didn't know much about migration when I started reporting on it a decade ago, but I've become, I guess, a bit of an expert on it. And this is what I know, and this is what I'm good at. And the more I dig in, the deeper I go, and the more likely I'm to get funding and opportunity and recognition.
Thank you. Thank you, Ismail. And I think you portrayed very fairly what is the challenges and the opportunities also of being freelancers, and also the idea that pushed us to build this collective Fada in order to kind of also fight this isolation and it's really vital to be able to exchange and to
exactly.
ideas,
and can I just add something quickly,
contacts.
which I didn't mention? Like, look, at the end of the day, it's really unfair. Like, I speak the English language and I was raised in it, and that's an advantage. And you're in Italy, and many people don't speak Italian outside Italy. That's just unfair. Like, you know, we've got to also be honest about the privileges. And I think it's also quite awful that the focus is on Anglo-Saxon, Western, you know, Germany and the UK and US, and that's where the main media still is, unfortunately, that pays. That's just the sad truth. I think that needs to change, but I think that makes it harder for Italian journalists. I really sympathize with the challenges that Italian journalists, friends I know, have in terms of trying to do foreign reporting. Nearly all the Italian journalist friends I have don't really work in Italy so much anymore. You know, they're writing for the mainstream newspapers in America and the UK. And in Germany, that's how they're surviving.
Yeah, definitely. This is also, I mean, this is also one of the reasons we created Fada, to kind of bring our work also in Italy and spread it around, because sometimes we feel detached.
Yes, because people don't see your work, because you write often in other languages, don't you? I see your work in Der Spiegel, and like, I guess people in Italy, you know, aren't reading that maybe, so, you know.
Yeah. Yes. So let me move back to your work, and we'd like to kind of explore with you the trails you've been following. And I have like 3 questions in one, let's say, because you already mentioned some of the projects, kind of longer projects you have worked on in the past years. One of this project is Lost in Europe. Then there's a project that follows Chinese influence in Eastern Africa, and there are your beautiful reports on train or missed train in Ethiopia and the region. So I'd like to ask you a bit to give us some background on why did you choose and why did you started working on this topic.
Great. I will start with the China and Africa, Giacomo. So I've been reporting across the continent, you know, from Senegal to Somalia for many years. And I have, everywhere I've gone over the last 7 years, like many other journalists, I've seen what the Chinese have been up to in terms of building roads, dams, airports, in terms of Chinese construction workers, in terms of Chinese people on the ground, in terms of Chinese sort of little Chinatowns. I mean, I remember I hadn't been to Dakar for several years, but the last time I was to Dakar in 2018, you know, there was an actual Chinatown sort of coming up. So that wasn't something you would have seen a decade ago. So I was just interested in that. And I thought, what is happening? And others had written about this, of course, extensively. But when I decided to really investigate it, I applied for the Alicia Patterson Foundation Fellowship. Alicia Patterson was a pioneer journalist in America, and she died decades ago, and it's America's oldest writing journalism grant, which, by the way, anybody can apply for. So I applied for idea of doing a year-long reportage looking at China's role, which I did last year, which is a real privilege. And the way I set this up was to sort of ask a question. I thought, so we know China is Africa's largest investor, largest trading partner, that China is, you know, no big news to anyone watching, but China is on the rise. It's on the cusp of becoming the most powerful country in the world. And often the last few decades, Africa has been neglected by Western countries, by the United States. Under Barack Obama, which I wrote a piece years back, actually, that he was a bit of a disappointment to most African countries, really, because he didn't really invest and really focus that much on the continent. And there was a policy that Obama had pioneered called Power Africa, which was sort of, you know, it didn't really go anywhere. And there was this long-term strategic shift happening. And America's pivot was to Asia, Pacific. Europe was focused with its migrant crisis and, you know, the Eurozone crisis. And China really stole a march on the rest quietly for the last 2 decades, has really expanded its footprint across the continent. And I wanted to understand that, but understand it from a different perspective, because people had written about the economics, the numbers. So I wasn't so interested in that. I was interested much more in the human dimension. And I will tell you some things worked and some things didn't work briefly. So when I pitched the story as a project to be funded by the Alicia Paxton Foundation, I just put a simple question, which was China in Africa, is it win-win cooperation or neo-colonialism? Which is it? Because we've heard repeatedly by the Chinese leaders and by African governments, in Kenya right now, that this is a win-win situation. The Chinese win and the Africans win. But is that actually true on the ground? And what do people actually feel about this on the ground? I went to Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia, and Tanzania. I wish I'd gone to other countries in the west of the continent, but for a number of reasons, I could not. So I only got a limited view, perhaps from the east and central parts of Africa. I had reported about China in West Africa previously. So the story you mentioned is the railway that this is the SGR, it's called, and it's a standard gauge railway. And it's a railway which connects Addis Ababa, capital of Ethiopia, to Djibouti. And it's basically built along most of it along the lines of an old French-built railway, which was built under Menelik II, or started under Menelik II, Emperor of Ethiopia. And this, had cost, quite an enormous amount of money. It's 750 kilometers. I tried to take the train, and it became a story that, the train hadn't been working, hadn't been in operation. And it's, quite a humorous story. It was like a comedy, one thing going wrong after another. I was in Addis Ababa. I was trying to find out where the station was. It's not on Google Map at that point. It was impossible. I tried to get the tickets, but then I turned up at this ticket office in Addis, and they said, well, we don't sell train tickets, we sell bus tickets. And I said, bus tickets, but I want a train ticket. And they said, oh, no, we can't do that here, which is sort of typical in Ethiopia. You go somewhere and you always get this kind of answer, unfortunately. So it's a quite humorous thing. And I was trying to get from Addis Ababa to Giorgio in the eastern part of Ethiopia, which is the second city, which actually has a very beautiful old French-built railway station there. But the railway wasn't working. And there'd been lots of technical issues with the track. They didn't build enough bridges, I don't think, around it, so they couldn't get access to it. There were collisions with camels and cattle of Afaris, and they wanted competition with the government. There have been stoppages to this to the railway because of technical issues, and it's never really gained the speed and the kind of function it is, thought that they would. On the other hand, actually, Kenya's SGR, which is from Mombasa to Nairobi, which I also took, and that does work, but again, it's expensive. There are delays. They were extending it from the capital here in Nairobi to Naivasha, which is not too far from the capital here, which they haven't. Actually, I was driving the other weekend with some friends, and we saw the railway just literally stopped halfway in the middle of the mountains. So again, I wanted to do that kind of reporting to try and get a sense of, going on a train. It's really simple, and seeing what it's like and taking the experience from. So you can read that; it's all online. But actually, this is what's problematic about the China-Africa question. The answer that the question I put on the answer is yes and no. There is a bit of both, and it's not quite a how should I say? It's not quite a satisfactory answer, because you sort of want to say it is this or that, but it's not. It's much more multifaceted and complicated relationship that China and Africa has. Kenya is an interesting case because Kenya owes over 72% of its debts to China. China is heavily invested in its media. That's where the Chinese media is located in Nairobi. They invested billions here. There have been issues. I did another story from a market, second-hand clothes market in Kenya, which is in Nairobi, and Chinese traders, were setting up in the market to compete against Kenyan traders, creating a lot of tension. So across the continent, not just on that story, but also, looking at what the Chinese have been doing in Zambia, looking at the tensions that were happening there with the debt, looking at what the Chinese are up to in Tanzania, both the contemporary but also the historical, the Tazara line, which is another railway. I love trains. And another railway line, which is quite impressive, is the Tazara to Tanzania Zambia Railway, which goes from Dar es Salaam to Zambia and was built by the Chinese. Actually began under Mao, and it was the first and the largest ever single sort of foreign, development investment China had made back then. And that was quite an interesting story, and that was really interesting to take that train. So I was trying to sort of take perspective on what China is doing across the continent and reporting it, but from a different perspective, and looking at, as I said, from the human perspective. And I have to say, in the end, it was very difficult to talk to Chinese people that are on the ground in Kenya. I began a couple of stories which I didn't get to finish. I was looking at the situation between, Chinese couples marrying African couples in Kenya or Senegal, wherever, and this sort of generation of mixed Chinese African babies. I was very interested in that story because I think that's a really interesting story. I was also very interested in looking at Chinese kids that were doing gap years. They were teaching Mandarin in Kenya, and I met a couple of them through this program, but I could never get enough in order to do the story. So there were things that I could still follow up, and I might still in the future. The other thing you asked me, Giacomo, was about Lost in Europe. Is that right? Yeah, so I've already mentioned Lost in Europe. So it's a cross-border journalism project looking at the disappearances of child migrants in Europe. And again, we began the project, it's an investigative project, about 3 years ago. And this is after Europol, Chief of Staff of Europol said that there were 10,000, they believe, children that were missing in Europe, that were known but that had gone missing, that nobody knows where they've gone. And we just thought that's an extraordinary figure. And we just thought, how come no one is really looking into this at the European level? And because migration, like any issue, is cross-border, people enter the EU through Greece and Italy, but then they make their way, through multiple countries and routes. So you can't look at one aspect of their journey. You have to look at the whole perspective and the whole picture. So we are a team of investigative reporters. As I mentioned, we have Cecilia Ferrara in Italy, and Sana Terlingen, and Geesje van Haar in the Netherlands, and others who are working with us. And we're trying to investigate what happens. And we've done a number of stories, and I'll mention a couple. One of them is we looked at the situation for Vietnamese children in Europe. So we did an investigation, which we discovered that 60 Vietnamese children had disappeared from Dutch in the Netherlands shelters. These are shelters designed that are meant to protect them. These children had disappeared, often perhaps into the arms of trafficking gangs who want to exploit them and bring them often to the UK to work on cannabis farms and nail salons. In 2018, I did quite a big investigation in The Guardian, in which we revealed that hundreds of children had gone missing from local authority care. These are children's services of local authorities in England and Wales. Again, nobody knows what happened to those children. We did another investigation last year where we looked at the disappearances again in the Netherlands with Sana Terlingen from the Dutch broadcaster VPRO. We looked at the fact that African, largely Nigerian, pregnant women, they were 8, 9 months pregnant, had disappeared from Dutch shelters again. And we identified 25. And some, might have also disappeared from Switzerland and Germany, but we could never find out. But at least in the Netherlands, we were able to find 25. Now, nobody knows what happened to them, what becomes of their babies. Why would a mother-to-be or a mother who's got a newly born baby, why would she give up free shelter and accommodation and health access? Usually that's every mother wants the best for their baby or baby to be born. So again, that is something we looked into. And most recently, we've been also looking at I've been in Sicily for quite a while, in September to October, look at the situation for, Nigerian women there, which is not a new story. We know that's been happening for decades in Italy, that Nigerian women, largely from Edo state, have been trafficked, tricked, conned, held in juju chains, sort of witchcraft chains, and forced to get, work in forced sex work in Italy and places like Palermo. But that's not new necessarily, but what is new is that the numbers have doubled since 2015. We know that from the IOM. We also know that actually, anecdotally, that the ages are getting younger. And we've heard stories that in Libya, which haven't verified yet, but that the traffickers want to keep, because they're getting younger, the girls intact. because they, there's a higher going prices potentially for virginity. So I did a number of stories again then. The next stories that we're working on will be also largely focused really what's happening in Sicily, Libya, and Tunisia, and the situation in Morocco and Tenerife, and what's happening on that coast, the Atlantic coast of Africa. Also, we are very much interested in collaboration. So I know if there are journalists and colleagues that are listening, you can visit lostineurope.eu. That's lostineurope.eu. Get all the information you need there. We have Facebook, Twitter. Follow us there. But I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll give the floor back to Giacomo and Davide.
Thank you, Ismail. Thank you, really. So another step behind, because a few days ago, Giacomo sent me an emotional article he wrote for BBC News that we posted also on the Facebook event of today. Letter from Africa, how London was sold to a child fleeing war. This is an intense travel. It was an intense article, actually, and I found it really, really interesting, absolutely, because it was super personal on the one hand, but also on the other, so meaningful, no? So could you retrace those steps with us, with our listeners, and what does it mean for you coming back to Addis Ababa after years in another era, with another role, and you have been there several times, so yeah, no?
Yeah. Thank you, Davide. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that. So I guess, I write these letters from Africa. Often I'm actually not in Africa, I'm in Sicily when I'm writing them. But nonetheless, they're called Letters from Africa, which I do for the BBC once a month. And that was my January letter that I wrote from Addis Ababa. So for me, migration is both, what I report on as a reporter, but also obviously like all of us, Davide, I migrated from Italy to Senegal and so on. All of us on some level migrate, and migration is a fundamental human truth. And that's what people have been doing in this region since we evolved in East Africa. And as a species, we've been moving. And so for me, it's also a personal level. So it's also the journey I took as a child when I fled the war in Somalia. So I was born in Hargeisa, which is in the northwest of Somalia, which is now called the Republic of Somaliland, but it's not recognized by any other country yet. But I grew up there in a time that's very different from now, because in what's now called Somaliland, 70% of the people there are under the age of 25. Very few remember the war, but I remember it, and I lived through the first part of the war. And my father was a political activist, and so was my mother, and he was imprisoned and tortured for his political beliefs. And that's what happens when you're in a dictatorship, which we were in under Said Barre, who was a dictator who had this idea of what he called tribal socialism. And actually, Somali was only became a written language in 1972, and after that, he forced people into the countryside for forced mass education and so on. And then he began a very, silly and terrible and brutal short war, which he lost against Ethiopia in the Ogaden, in which Cuba was involved in the Soviets and so on. And he had this whole tension in the 70s and the 80s, between the Soviet bloc and between the Americans. And he wasn't really a true socialist in the communist Soviet sense. He was an opportunist, but anyway, he was a brutal dictator nonetheless, and he suppressed people in the northwest of what is now called Somaliland, which is where I was born and where I grew up. And in the late 80s, he began a process of what many now describe as genocide, largely targeted against the community in which I come from, that part of the country. And in 1988 is when the war began, really. But before that, there was a build-up. And in Hargeisa, there's a region outside the city, which is sort of at a fairly high elevation in the mountains. And there's a region called the Valley of Death. And inside the Valley of Death, there are experts believe up to 200 mass graves, which could, estimates suggest, contain up to 200,000 people. And I actually wrote a very long read, about this for The Nation, which is available, which I'm happy to share, which you can read and see the images also taken by the Peruvian forensic anthropologist who come a couple of times a year to work with the Somalian government to unearth what happened. So in a way, my own story began in the disintegration of the Somali state, and began with the violence and the killings of tens of thousands of people, including members of my own family. And, you know, like many people who were caught up in these events in the late 80s, we fled and we became refugees, like many did. And that was the largest refugee crisis in the world at the time. And then, you know, I grew up in a refugee camp in Ethiopia, on a border town. Near his camp was near this town which still exists, called Sheikh, which I went back to last year for the first time in over 26 years. So for me, going back to Addis Ababa and retracing that journey was really retracing the journey of, you know, kind of my own memory. And when I came to Addis, I was just almost 10, and I had been in and out of Addis a few times, but by that point, in 1994, I was on my way to the UK. And back in those days, Somalis, like Sudanese, I guess, like Kurds, like any people that were fleeing civil war context, could legitimately come to Europe through legal means. It was possible through, you know, number of ways. There's no, you know, there's a reason why today people come by boats to Europe. So those routes have been really shut down, and you know, there was a lot of legal systems that were in place. In the UK, for example, we had a thing that was known as exception leave to remain, which worked in the context of countries where there was civil conflict, which was then replaced by the end of the 1990s by humanitarian protection. And then it's just decreased in terms of the rights that people get now. So to cut a long story short, this is where I was, and I've been back to Addis many times since, as Davide mentioned. But the reason why I wrote that piece was more recently was because I actually went to the district, which I had avoided going because I had all these memories, was Bole Mikael, which is the Somali neighborhood in Addis Ababa, which is near Bole, which is the main, I guess, business area of Addis and where the airport is. And I just went there on Eid. I was living in Addis for 3 months last year as part of my China in Africa research. So I was lucky to be there for Eid, and I spent time inside the market and just getting to see people and how things change. And I think, you know, it's what happens, you know, when you, I'm still wrestling with this, and, you know, I'm writing about this also. You know, I'm currently preparing a book about this. But, you know, thinking about what happens to people after war, what happens to families, like what happens to kids, like what do we remember, what happens to families. So for me, it's still something that's personal, but also I want to take that personal experience as a reporter and then ask a bigger question, but what is it like for other people? Like, what is it like for other people from this region? Like, what have they gone through? And I think, you know, as you know, it's 30 years since the Somali state collapsed now. And Somalia is still, in large parts of it, remain a dangerous place. You know, there are attacks almost every other week, sometimes in Dusha, sadly, by Al-Shabaab and others. So the situation hasn't necessarily changed. It has changed in some ways. But for me, this piece was really about remembering all the people that, you know, I saw growing up in this neighborhood who I've never seen again. And there was this, thing in the 90s where people were very hopeful that they were waiting to get out from somewhere dangerous, and they were going to the promised land in Europe, and people didn't know where they were going. Nobody knew what Europe was. You know, people were going to Finland, and nobody ever heard of Finland, right? You know, where the hell is Finland anyway? You know, or Sweden, all these countries nobody knew, and now in Finland, you know, Somalis constitute, I think, the single largest visible minority, for example. So these histories are important and they need to be told. And I think, you know, telling them through this lens it's always an interesting way, and a way which obviously I hope resonates with people, and it clearly has with you, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, this is, I mean, just even back your words, also it brings to my memory the impression and feelings in reading the article you wrote for BBC.
Thank you very much.
I think kind of also really helps connecting a lot of dots. And of course, as for everybody of us, we have personal motivation to do what we are trying to do as journalists, and then and so kind of the shape of our route through journalism is also coming or being influenced by these personal experiences, and I really think that when I hear about your experiences, there are many dots to connect between Eastern Africa, and the situation of refugees and colonialism in different forms, and what's happening in Europe for children, and for example, like Palermo and Sicily as a meeting place of these two stories, as a place of contamination, and this is really important.
Exactly. I think that's really important, Giacomo. I want to say, Palermo is a fascinating place, and I think, it's a place of the intersection of Europe and Africa. It's a place where cultures have been meeting for a long time, and where cultures are colliding all the time. And I think Italy is a really interesting country for this as well, because, Italy is a young country. People forget this in the context of Europe, right? I mean, unification is only what, how many years? 150, 160? You can tell me. It was 1861, wasn't it? So it's really interesting. And what I find interesting is, going back to the first question, is Italy was very keen to launch a colonial project instantly, because that's how you had to be a great European power. And the British sort of helped the Italians in East Africa because they wanted to stop the French. And of course, we have to remember these histories in Italy. And also, I think we talk about migration in Italy. I want to quickly say, migration in Italy has also, I've done many stories, has been happening for a long time. There are very old Somali, Eritrean, Albanian communities that exist. Tunisians for centuries have been coming to Sicily. And that is important for us to reflect. And also, I just wanted to mention another story, which I know you're all very familiar with, but Giorgio Marincolla, his story is amazing. And, I was able to write a piece about him, which was republished in Internationale, which I'll share on the link. But, again, these histories have to be remembered, because these histories are often erased. And the reason to think about this from a post-colonial perspective, and to think of a decolonial frame, is that we always have to ask whose histories are told and whose histories are forgotten, and whose voices are given a platforms and whose voices are denied a platform, because that's what the media is really about. And I think, Fada, and what you're doing is about changing the narrative, especially in Italy, which is so needed, I think, as a foreigner coming to Italy and as a reporter. Ashamed to say I still don't speak Italian, I'm sorry. But, I feel I know enough a little bit to kind of make these comments, but, to say I think it's needed in Italy, because Italy sometimes feels very parochial. People in Italy just don't, I don't know, just think, oh, why they're here, and the media doesn't talk about this, unfortunately, and it's a real shame. And we have all the time in Italy this very right-wing agenda happening, which is very dangerous and fascistic, and has to be fought against.
Allora, intanto volevo ricordare a chi ci segue, sorry if I switch to Italian, volevo ricordare a chi ci segue che se ci sono se c'è qualsiasi tipo di domanda, qualsiasi tipo di curiosità, può postarle tranquillamente nei commenti, e noi le gireremo direttamente a Ismail. A questo punto So I'm going to ask you, Ismail, my question, because I asked it to the public if they have any questions, of course. My question is about
social networks. Okay.
Social network. Social network. a particular issue, I think, because it affects all of us, no? It was a revolution in many ways. It touched, for sure, also journalists and the way of doing journalists, etc., etc. So, first of all, what's your relationship with social network? I mean, in one hand, they give you the possibility to connect to the rest of the world and find contacts too. But in the other hand, they are perhaps the root of the spread of fake news and fast food news too. No, how do you protect yourself as a freelance journalist and a reader too? If you have any advice also for the listeners, because it's something that affects all of us.
Yes, good question. I think we live in this age of lies, falsehoods, alternative facts. As Kellyanne Conway, advisor to President Trump, famously said, in fact, it's just lies and falsehood and disinformation, and we see that spread across the globe. Indeed, right here in East Africa, in Kenya, to where you are in Italy, in Senegal, and the US and UK. And as journalists working in this space, it's really challenging. I've been actually increasingly covering this issue of disinformation. I've done a story just recently from Sicily, looking at what the Sicilian governor or president is doing when it comes to misinformation around COVID, and the fact that migrants are seen as carriers of the disease or stigmatized or labeled as being carriers of COVID, and how that's creating this populist backlash, and they're using the migrant issue or to basically win political points because it works, because they're seeing Salvini do it. And now COVID has changed everything, and it's allowing them to capitalize on people's fears, which is happening right on the streets of Palermo. The mood is changing, and I felt that when I was there in September and October, which was quite a shame because it's a very open-minded city. I think in terms of social networks as journalists, we can't live without it because we need to get our work out there, but it depends what platform you're engaging with. I use largely Twitter and Facebook. Instagram I have, but it's a personal space for me, which I enjoy with my friends and family. I think what is quite scary is the ways in which content is now being labeled as fake news or as lies. That these are actual journalistic reports that we've done. I'll just share something with you very quickly, which has happened in the last 24 hours or something. So I redid my most recent story about how African culture is reshaping Sicily, and how Sicily is inspiring African artists and music. And it's about this cultural meeting point that is happening. Fascinating story. And a friend of mine sent me a couple of things. Said these are from online sort of far right websites in Italy. It was all in Italian, so I had to translate it into Google Translate. So it wasn't maybe completely perfect. But these news sites, there's quite a few of them written this, saying that I was unaware of the situation, that it was basically a kind of propaganda that the BBC and I were engaging in by saying that Sicily is a place of migration, and that basically I refuse to see the fact that migration in Sicily is about the Nigerian mafia, about black acts, and they're accusing me. But of course, that's not true. And of course, the story I was working on had a particular angle. But if they've done their research, they'll know I write about the criminal fraternities and I cover the mafia and what is going on. But also, we know that in Italy, this is one of the things that the far right say about migration. They try and always tie it to criminality, because that's what scares people, and that's then what will say, let's just close the borders, let's stop people from, being rescued in the sea, which is already happening, right? I mean, people are not being rescued in the sea, and people are still dying, and that's horrible, and that's shocking. So I think this is another thing that's happened in the last few years. I noticed people no longer will just tweet hate, racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia at you as a journalist. They now say what you're saying is a lie. It's fake news, and I think that's changed. And how to combat that is a real challenge for us. And also looking at the role of, algorithms, and looking at the role of digital, space, which is going so quickly. I think it's a real challenge for most of us, who are doing normal day-to-day reporting. It's very hard to fight against that, and I think there's often a very political agenda by those people who have an agenda, which often, is not the mainstream, and often is quite right wing, and they want to shut people down, and they want to change the narrative. And the reason the final point I'll make about this, the reason why people in the last couple of days have been so angry about my BBC story is simple, because it's the BBC. The BBC is the largest media broadcaster in the world. And if you're going to read anything about Sicily, if you Google Sicily, African culture, I guess you'll probably see my story first, because it's just the BBC, and they're angry because they don't want that changes the narrative. And that's why they're attacking me. And they're not attacking me, they're attacking my journalism and my integrity and my credibility, saying I'm unaware, how do they know that? Have they reported from Palermo? I have no idea. Have they been to the place I've been? No, probably not. I've been reporting from Palermo for 5 years. So the point is, that doesn't matter. So this is what's changed. And I don't know how you fight that. That's a real challenge for us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Ismail, I think this is, what you said is really powerful and urgent. And of course, I'm sorry that you fell under this kind of online, on one side, delegitimization of your work, which is used for, of course, political propaganda and can also turn into hate speech, or it's a part of a kind of whole discourse that uses also hate speech to create consensus around these ideas, which are of course not based on any research or real facts, and that's what we are also trying to do, and you are trying so much to do, and I'm sure you've passed much more time in Palermo than the people that have written this and spreaded this news around, and especially not with the kind of an idea of really getting in touch with the people, and this your invitation of challenging the narrative on migration, which means also challenging the narrative that we can have from Europe on society, politics, culture in Africa, because it's kind of part of the same dimension. It's really important, and it's part of what we are trying to do also with these meetings. So we just reached 1 hour, and that's our usual length. But we want to, before leaving, we want to ask you one last thing. If you'd like to share with us, something about what you are going to do now. What's your future plans of reporting, if it's something you can do or you wish to do?
Sure.
And also, thank God, that's great. And also, if there's any specific story you would, either if you had the funding and the time and the resources you would like to follow now, or you would suggest to some young freelancer who's approaching the job, there's a hidden story, you should go to in that country to follow this. Is this something that you feel it's important, but it's not enough reported nowadays, that you would like to yourself or to suggest others to cover this story?
Thank you so much. It's been really pleasurable being with you all, and thank you for the questions and comments. I'm happy to stay on, so please keep the questions coming. So in terms of what I'm doing next, so I'm currently in Nairobi, which I'll be for the next coming months. I'm currently researching a book project potentially, which would be looking at the things that I mentioned about the war in Somalia. I'm also looking into the situation for refugees and COVID in the region. So I will have to do a story or two on that. I'm taking a bit of a break after a very busy year. I think David, excuse me, asked me a question about COVID and how that's changed my work. I have to say I've been very lucky. I have not been impacted by COVID directly. I've had more work than ever before. I know I'm very privileged in that, so I'm grateful for that, but I've been busier than ever before, so I'm taking a bit of a break, but I'm really looking forward to going back to Sicily, and I'll be there from spring, I hope, some point, and I'll continue investigating the Nigerian situation, which I think is so important. I think particularly looking at the connections between the criminal groups that are operating in Sicily, I think it's quite interesting. I'm also very interested in looking at more cultural stories in Italy. I always love that cultural space. I think there's fascinating things happening in Italy, which I love seeing. I'm going to try and learn Italian. I've got my Italian class with my teacher, my insegnata. I hope I said that right, Laura. I hope I will be a better Italian speaker next time we speak. And the other question you asked, I think, is such a good one, which is about young reporters and particularly in Italy. I think the most obvious thing I would say in Italy is learn another language. I know it sounds a bit awful thing to say, I'm sorry, but if you can, if you're still studying, basically improve your French or English, because that will really help. Second thing I would say is that you got to realize there's 1,000 stories in Italy. I don't know the north of Italy. I've only been once or twice. And, it was nice and lovely, but it's sort of like London, and I didn't like it very much. So, for me, I'm, committed to the south of Italy, and I love the south, and, I love Sicily. And I think there's a story in every corner, and I'm always disappointed every time I leave Palermo, because there's always a story that I could have told that I didn't get a chance to tell. So what I would say is start local. Like, you don't need to go, because right now I'm on this, interweb thing, and with Davide and Giacomo, and you don't need to be in Kenya or Dakar or anywhere else to tell a good story. Start where you live. Like, what is happening in your local migration reception center? I don't know. What is happening in your local hospital? Like, what is happening in the police station? Like, what are the local authorities doing? Start local, because I think that's the way you do good journalism. I started local. My first job was just a researcher in BBC in London, and I had to do stories in the London area. So that taught me a lot of really important skills. So I think if you can get any good experiences doing that at the beginning is really great. I think then finding, I can't really advise on paid jobs in journalism in Italy. I know La Repubblica, L'Espresso, and Rai, and others, obviously Internazionale, obviously are paying and have, opportunities there. But then I would encourage you then to kind of go and, if you learn Arabic or Spanish or French, then it's also useful. So maybe go to the Maghreb, go to, what's happening in the Middle East, in Francophone Africa, because that's a very big part of, the story in Italy. And I think that could also work. And final thing I would say is also, it's okay if you end up like working in the NGO world for a bit, or if you do comms or whatever. Journalism is a long game. So, don't be disappointed if your first job isn't in journalism. Like, you can do it on the side, do it on the weekends. It's the nature of the business. And finally, I would say find, I know I said finally twice, but this is finally, I think finally find a network like Fada, but also find a pan-European network. It's really important. Work with other journalists, make friends with other people in other countries. Like, ask them what they're doing, try and connect up, and try and get into applying for grants and that sort of stuff also would be very good.
Thank you so much, Ismail. It was really interesting, and that's and also, as you said, the idea is one of the listener, Ruben, just posted to start local.
We are born nomads. Yeah, I agree. I'm a nomad too, Ruben. But you can still be a nomad from go from Lazio to like Milano. That's still quite a distance, and Italy is the most interesting country in Europe, really. Like, every region is different in Italy. You go 30 miles, and you have a different food culture. So you might as well be in, like, Timbuktu. So, you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, I think Ruben, who's also a colleague, a journalist, and a friend, is also representing our kind of desire to start traveling again as soon as we can.
Yes, that's
yeah, but of course, it's a part of our job, and also probably of the fact of being nomads and our. So that was really interesting. I think we gave to the listener 1 hour of English, of kind of repeating and some English, and some of the people in the audience appreciated, even if we know that in Italy it's a bit hard sometimes to make events in English, but we did it, and
it's my fault. I'm really sorry. I will speak Italian next time we do this, I promise.
Yeah, but then many people, the comments are really positive, and I really think you kind of we have on the table many interesting, topic that would need much more debate and follow up, and we are happy. We are in touch with you, of course, and we invite everybody to follow your work, and especially since you'll be reporting also in the next months from Kenya and Eastern Africa, and that's very vital reporting, and you will publish soon. So that's a good news. And so I'll give I'll move on, and maybe we'll shift to back to Italian with Davide. So to sum up and finish our today meeting.
E siccome io sono di poche parole, io sono proprio vado allo stretto necessario. Grazie Ismail.
Grazie mille.
E volevamo ringraziare anche Arianna Pagani, che è la donna dietro a tutto questo, eccola, che arriva da Bologna. E volevamo ringraziare ovviamente chi ci è stato ascoltare per questa poco più di un'ora, ma di vero e interessante giornalismo, e quindi ringraziamo tutti. Ismail, stay with us, and just a second, and we are going out of live.